Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to have you with us today. It's a real pleasure to see you all in this important day. Hogan, Lovells, and Payet, Rey, Cauvi, Perez Abogados are working as a team to host today's webinar. Hogan Lovells has a global footprint in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. In several countries in Latin America, we act with strategic partners to serve our clients. That is precisely the case of Peru, and it's with great pride that we join forces with Payet, Rey, Cauvi, Perez Abogados today. Peru is one of the most important jurisdictions to do business in all of South America. Peru is a country with over 30 million people and a surface of 1,285,000 square kilometers. That makes Peru the third largest country in South America and the 20th worldwide. As in many other countries in the region, Peru suffered for decades of instability and poor economic performance. However, in the last 20 years, Peru has enjoyed an impressive economic growth pattern that has been hailed by experts and consultants overseas. In recent times, however, we have seen some political turmoil, same that resulted in Peru having three different presidents in less than a month in the late 2020. Given the significance of those news and the impact of COVID-19 in 2020, our two firms considered that it was important to discuss the current status of the investment climate in Peru and explain what are the implications of domestic policies and issues for companies doing business or planning to engage in business in that Andean country. With these ideas in mind, it gives me a great pleasure to present the panel that will walk us through the most significant aspects of what is happening in Peru and the real substantive information that should be kept in mind to this end. We have three great panelists today. Let me introduce them to you as follows. José Carlos Saavedra. José Carlos is a partner and the chief economist at APOYO Consultoría, where he is in charge of macroeconomic forecasts and the identification of opportunities and risks that the economic environment poses for business. Prior to joining APOYO, he held positions in the Peruvian Central Bank, academic, and other private sector institutions. José Carlos holds a master's degree in economics from NYU. José Cúneo. José is a partner at Payet, Rey, Cauvi, Perez Abogados, and he leads the environmental and mining areas, specializing in corporate law, financial transactions, M&A, and mining transactions. He regularly advises local and international mining companies and other participants in the mining sectors, as well as investors and financiers. Finally, Carlos Patrón. Carlos is also a partner at Payet, Rey, Cauvi, Perez Abogados, specializing in antitrust, regulatory law, telecom, energy, corporate law, and civil law. Carlos has extensive experience in both the analytical and regulatory issues related to Peruvian competition law, covering a wide array of industries. Carlos has actually participated in leading antitrust cases, including the most emblematic price-fixing investigations carried out in Peru. Before moving into the panel, a couple of housekeeping issues. To ensure that we can address any of your questions, please make sure that you use during the presentations the Q&A tool that is right there in the menu of the Zoom platform. Please pose your questions. The questions can be posed either in English or Spanish, no limitation there, and we will gladly process and organize them to present them to the speakers once they complete their individual presentations. The chat will not be the right method so please use the Q&A tool. To jumpstart the process and get into full speed ahead and get a feel for the audience's perception on significant issues, we have prepared 4 poll questions that you will be able to answer online by pressing the specific answer options of your choice in each case. With this poll, we will gauge your comments and thus give the panelists first-hand feedback to process in their presentations. Let us then proceed with the polling as follows. The questions that we are going to present you are the following. You will see them now on your screen, and you will be able to process the individual answers. You will see that there will be multiple options for you to answer them. So the first question is, has the impact of COVID-19 and recent political instability changed your perception or potential appetite to invest in Peru? And you have 2 options there. Number 2, do you perceive Peru as being a friendly jurisdiction for foreign investments? Also 2 options. How much were your investment projections in Peru impacted in events in 2020? And you have additional options. And finally, in 2020, do you plan to? And you have several options. So please answer this as soon as you can, so that we can then see what the audience thinks about this for relevant topics. And we can see the results right now online immediately based on your specific feedback. So we as the panelists cannot vote, so we will have to wait for your specific feedback and answers. And our technical advisors will present to us the results shortly. So just make sure that you do go through all the 4 different questions so that we get the full sample of your opinion on the 4 different items. Again, you have 2 options in 1, 2 options in 2, 4 options in 3, and 4 options in 4. So a few seconds more to allow for all the participants to enter their answers, and we'll see the results momentarily. Just a few more seconds and we will see the results. Okay, again, our technical experts will tell us when the answers are in and we can see the results. Just a few more seconds. I believe the program is processing the answers and we should see them now very quickly. Okay. We now have, okay, we need a few more to get a full sample. We have now close to 50% of the attendance. So if the rest could input their answers, otherwise we won't be able to see everyone's opinion. And it's important for us to make sure that we have the full participation. Just a few more seconds and then we can close it. And our technical support team may process and provide us with the answers so that we can see them. Okay, 10 more seconds, and here we go. So here are the answers based on your specific question. So we have, interestingly, clearly their number one is overwhelmingly a yes. So there is an impact on what COVID-19 and political stability has changed. So it's something for the panelists to consider. We have a closer result on number two, but we have a perception that Peru is a friendly jurisdiction, 61%. That's a very good outcome. And then we have a number three. The leading result was whether your investments were impacted in events, somewhat reduced was the leading answer. Closely followed, I guess the next one would be not at all, so more on the positive side. And finally, number four, I guess the leading answer is to invest less than in 2020. Interesting outcome. Again, hopefully this last answer is modified after you hear our experts. So we'll see what happens in your perception. But I'm very confident that we will see perhaps some changes once we hear from an expert. So thank you again for participating in this polling exercise. Without further ado, let me transfer now the floor to our panelists. They will speak each for no more than 15 minutes and will discuss the following topics. First, we'll hear from José Carlos Saavedra, again from APOYO Consultoría, and he will talk to us about COVID and the economic overview. He will see what happened with COVID-19 in Peru, and still obviously is an issue, and a forecast for economic recovery. Then we'll hear from José Cúneo about post-pandemic investment opportunities. He will talk about specific areas of opportunities in mining, projects and infrastructure, and business and climate change, projects and infrastructure in general. Finally, we'll hear from Carlos Patrón, and he will talk about business climate and changes to the rules of game. In fact, Carlos is quoted today in Latin Lawyer precisely talking about changes to the antitrust statutes in Peru. So without further ado, Jose Carlos, please proceed, and then we will have Jose and Carlos proceed with their own presentations, and we'll switch back to you guys in a few minutes. Thank you very much, and take it from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. Yes, this year is uncertain for the business environment because uncertainty comes from different dimensions: COVID, the political environment, and the situation in which the Peruvian economy is right now after so many months of restrictions and negative economic impacts. But I would like to talk a bit about the features of this crisis during the last few months, so we can understand better why we expect that the economic recovery from now on will be kind of slow. No, even though we think that we will see high growth rates in 2021, 8%, 10% of GDP growth rates in this year. I will argue that most of the recovery in the Peruvian economy has already happened during the last few months. And if we compare the GDP levels from now with the ones that we will see at the end of this year, the growth rate between those 2 points will be low. No, will be small, the growth rate. That's one important feature I would like to address. But let me first give you some insights about the impact of the crisis in the Peruvian economy. Please help me with the slide. To the next slide, please. Peru has been one of the countries that was hit hardest by the COVID-19, both in terms of the number of COVID cases and also in terms of the size of the recession. One important reason behind this fact was the general lack of good health system. Just to give you one example, you can see in the graph on the left-hand side in this slide that the number of intensive care units, ICU beds per capita in different countries differs a lot. While in the USA and Germany, those countries had more than 25 beds per 100,000 inhabitants. In Peru, it was less than 1. And I don't think that has changed a lot during the last few months. So I would say that even now, after those months, the capacity in the health system is still ill-prepared to face a potential second wave of COVID. So in this situation, the health system in Peru was going to collapse rapidly if the government didn't react soon or with strong measures. That was very clear from the beginning. That's why Peru was one of the first countries to implement the lockdown, a strict lockdown in the world in March 15th. So Peru implemented one of the most drastic restrictions on mobility and on the operation of companies compared to other countries in the world. The impact or the economic impact was huge. As you can see in the other graph, Peru stands out as the country with the deepest fall in GDP during the second quarter. So it's a relationship between how strict the lockdowns were and how deep the recessions were in each country. And Peru, it's just in the corner, no? Next slide, please. Unfortunately, closing the economy was not enough to limit the spread of the virus effectively. Actually, Peru also has one of the highest numbers of deaths per capita in the world, as you can see in the table in the right side of this slide. This is because we think that the explanation of this is the high levels of informality in the country. That the informality challenged the social distancing strategy in Peru. Informal workers, those who represent 70% of the workforce in Peru, is one of the highest levels of informality in the world. Those workers, informal workers, do not have any labor contract. They are not registered anywhere. Usually don't have savings. They don't have proper access to credit, and they earn their money on a daily basis. So they were not allowed to work, but the government couldn't transfer money easily to them because most of them were not in any database or didn't have any bank account. So it was very difficult to deal with this due to these high levels of informality. I would say that informality had a negative multiplier effect of this crisis in Peru. I think that's very clear for the Peruvian economy and maybe for other Latin American countries as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Peru suffered one of the worst health and economic crises during the second quarter. This pandemic hit us in our weakest spots: labor market informality, lack of good social protection system, and poor public services in general. And our famous macroeconomic strength couldn't avoid the collapse of GDP and employment because the economy was closed. But our macroeconomic strength did help us to avoid the wave of bankruptcies during the lockdown and allowed the government to implement a very large monetary and fiscal response. And you can see that in the graph on the right side of this slide, Peru implemented a sizable policy response in terms of expenditures, cash transfers to families, a huge liquidity program from the central bank that was very successful. So that was possible because Treasury had savings and low debt to GDP, a really low debt to GDP ratio, and the central bank had a lot of credibility, something that other central banks in the region don't have, and large foreign reserves. So that allowed the economy to recover quickly during the third and the fourth quarter of last year. We had one of the deepest recessions in the second quarter, but one of the most rapid recoveries in the region in the following quarters. The economic policy response to the crisis boosted credit growth to companies and sustained households' consumption. Actually, one thing that is really interesting to see is that if you compare how the labor income declined during this crisis, it declined an aggregate like 25-30%. 25-30% is huge, that decline. But consumption declined only 10%. That gap is explained by the policy response. So after falling 30% in the second quarter, the economy is now falling just 3%. And this decline of 3% is less than what you see in other Latin American countries. Next slide, please. However, it's important to notice that the labor market, it's really depressed. It's still depressed. Labor income, the quality of jobs has deteriorated significantly, and this is something that could affect our capacity to recovery in the next few months. And next slide, please. And another thing I would like to point out is that although the recovery of economic activity has been fast, it has also been very uneven. Some markets, as you can see in the graph in this slide, some markets are growing fast, are growing 20% compared to the same levels of last year due to the policy response or due to the change in consumers' preferences in this due to this pandemic, while other sectors or markets are still behind. In general, according to one survey we made a few weeks ago, 50% of big firms have more or less recovered their pre-COVID sales levels. No, so half. No, it's something maybe something that we should keep in mind. Next slide, please. So from now on, the recovery, we think that recovery will be slow, even though the recovery was fast during the last few quarters. We think that the Peruvian economy has already recovered a big chunk of the lost ground during the last few quarters. However, from now on, as I said, we expect a rather slow recovery. We will certainly see impressive growth rates in the next few quarters, double-digit, second quarter, third quarter, because we are comparing economy without lockdown with one with lockdown. The economy will grow 8% or 10% in 2021 as a whole. However, if we compare the economy at the end of the last year, December 2020, with the economy at December of 2021, the growth rate between those 2 points will be only 1 or 2%. So that's a real growth rate that we will see. And I think this is very important to keep in mind. The annual growth rates will be kind of won't give you a good view of what's going on in the economy. So we think there is a lot of uncertainty coming from different angles, and we think I would like to mention 4 key drivers that will shape the economic recovery in Peru. The first is that it's kind of clear that the international environment will be favorable for the Peruvian economy, as the same happens with other Latin American countries. High commodity prices, low interest rates, it's something that the Peruvian economy could enjoy this year. Second, the progress in the vaccination against the COVID-19 will be key. This is particularly important because we are seeing what appears to be the initial phase of a second wave in COVID cases, COVID deaths, and the demand of ICU beds. Actually, in the very short term, it's very likely to see more restrictions than less restrictions from the government. And that could slow the recovery in the first half of this year. However, yesterday, President Sagasti announced that the government finally secured 38 million doses of the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine and 14 million of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The plan is to vaccinate 15 million people by July this year, and that would cover more than the first line and the most vulnerable people in Peru. That is really good news. However, I think that the positive impact of this news on the economy will be felt mostly during 2022, not this year, because this will take time, probably. Third, business confidence. The survey we made at the beginning of this panel is very clear. Given these events, political events, the COVID pandemic, investors are thinking twice before increasing their investments in Peru, even though we saw some improvements in the willingness to invest or hire in large private companies in Peru in the last few quarters. I think this year will be really uncertain and will hinder a faster recovery in this regard. And finally, it related to the last part I mentioned. Most companies consider that social conflicts, regulatory risks, and from Congress and the presidential election are the main risks in the business environment. I think this part is crucial. I think we will talk about that later in this panel. So I won't go further in this issue. And just to the last slide, please. So we think the Peruvian GDP will grow around 9% in 2021. But as I mentioned, these high growth rates are explained what have already happened, it's not explained from growth from now on into the next few quarters. That's why these high growth rates will be felt by the business community as a weak growth environment. For example, even though we will grow 9%, we think that wages won't increase much. We think that some companies, that in private investment won't grow fast in terms of increasing capacity, because there is a lot of excess of capacity in the economy, with low pressures on prices like the inflation, interest rate. So we will have impressive growth rates, but it won't be felt like that in the business environment. And I think I overreached my time, so I will stay there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, José Carlos. That was most informative and very critical to understand the current economic climate and the challenges that Peru has faced and what will come in the near future. José, your turn, please.
Thank you, Juan Francisco. Thank you, José Carlos, also. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are very glad to have you with us this morning. Can you put the next slide, please? Times of crisis are also times for potential opportunities. And even though the next years are going to be difficult, as José Carlos mentioned, we think that Peru still is a jurisdiction that can provide opportunities for investment during the next couple of days and in a post-pandemic environment. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, it was interesting from the poll that most people consider that Peru was a friendly jurisdiction for foreign investment, which I think is true. The Peruvian Constitution recognizes the same treatment to foreign investment and to national investment. We do not have any exchange control restrictions, and there are no restrictions to remit funds abroad also. And Peru is party to the the treaties for protection, the most important treaty for protection of investment. So from that side, we consider that Peru is an attractive jurisdiction for foreign investment. Also, what Jose Carlos also mentioned, Peru has one of the strongest macroeconomic fundamentals in the region due to very disciplined and strict fiscal and monetary policies that has been ongoing for the last 30 years. And that has helped to isolate the economy of Peru from political turmoil, at least at some point. And that has kept the Peruvian economy strong, even though, despite the current crisis of COVID-19. The expected rebound of economy of Peru, as Jose Carlos also mentioned, has been quite fast. So the economy has recovered quite fast during the last quarters, even though the future recovery could be a bit slow, as Jose Carlos said. I think that that is a signal that Peruvian economy on its basis is strong, and it's a jurisdiction that maintains attractiveness for potential investment. One important thing to consider also is that Peru has a huge infrastructure gap, mainly on public services. So that means that Peru, the government of Peru, will need to invest in infrastructure in the next couple of years to keep up with the requirements of the population. That has been shown by the problems that we had with the health system. So it is expected that Peru in the next years will have to invest in infrastructure, and the government is right now experiencing other forms of trying to develop public infrastructure. We will see that in the next slides. Well, also Peru has abundance of natural resources, mainly on minerals, fishing, agricultural products, which makes it attractive for foreign investment. And also in certain sectors, there's high potential demand that needs to be attended. For example, in the real estate and construction sectors, the agribusiness sectors, and also on the retail sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what's happening on infrastructure in Peru? As I mentioned, there's a huge gap on infrastructure in Peru. The short-term infrastructure gap has been estimated in $32.5 billion, which means that to keep up with that in the next following years, the Peruvian government will need to invest around 4% of the GDP to cover that and to close that gap. And in that sense, in 2019, the government issued this Plan Nacional de Infraestructura para la Competitividad, PNIC, which purpose is to establish a list of prioritized infrastructure projects. And in that plan, 52 infrastructure projects were identified. The identification was done with best international practices, with the support of the United Kingdom government and the Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. And those 52 infrastructure projects were identified as a priority, and they are mostly related to transportation and communications, sanitation, energy, and agriculture. Those projects are all around the country. Next slide, please. In these two charts, you will see the distribution of these 52 infrastructure projects. The first chart shows the distribution by sector, and you can see there that the main sector on which these 52 projects are related to are transportation and communications, which represent 82.5 million soles of investment. Followed by energy, sanitation, and agriculture. And those 52 projects add up 99 billion soles of investment in these prioritized projects. The second chart shows what are the mechanisms that are going to be used for the development of these projects. And you can see that most of them will be developed through the public-private partnership, which has been the main mechanism used by Peru in the last decades to develop projects. You can see there that 29 of the 52 projects will be developed by public-private partnerships. However, the government still plans to develop certain of those projects through public works. 17 of those 52 are public, infrastructure to be developed directly by the public sector. And you have these 6 projects in assets, which basically is assets that the state will transfer to private in exchange of retaining an economic interest on them. Next slide, please. This chart also shows what is the status of development of these projects. And as you can see, most of these 52 projects are relatively mature. Either they are in process of being structured and technically established by the government. But most of them, or at least have a big chunk of them, are already at a stage where they could be executed and started to develop. Next one, please. So what's new in the infrastructure environment? Basically, as I mentioned, Peru has been development infrastructure through public-private partnerships, and Peru will continue to do that in the next years, certainly. But also, Peru has been experiencing with other kinds of mechanisms to develop public infrastructure, basically through government-to-government agreements. No? In 2019, Peru had to organize the Pan American Games, and we were way back in schedule to build the facilities for the games. So Peru entered into a government-to-government agreement with the United Kingdom, and it worked really well. No? Peru was able to finalize the construction of the facilities for the games, and that showed to the government that this could be a mechanism that could be used as an alternative to public-private partnerships to develop infrastructure. So right now, Peru is also developing infrastructure in other regions through this kind of government-to-government agreements. For instance, in the north of Peru, after the 2017 floodings, there needed to be a reconstruction of the north of Peru, the north coast of Peru, building bridges, health facilities, schools. And Peru has also entered into a government-to-government agreement with the UK for that purposes, and the reconstruction is intended to be carried out through that mechanism also. Chinchero, the airport in Peru, is also another example of that.
I think we have problems with Jose's connectivity. Let us see if that can be corrected, because we lost him for a few seconds now. If we don't recover, we can probably move on to the next panel, and Jose may conclude his comments in the final roundup. So perhaps, Carlos, it's your turn. I guess we will lose part of what Jose was saying, but I'll say that as many other governments in the region, I guess Peru is looking at specific opportunities to foster additional investment and to reactivate the economies of countries that have been severely impacted by COVID-19. And that's a real challenge. And that's a perfect gateway for what Carlos is going to talk to us about opportunities in the coming months, and what does the the regulatory and business environment look like in Peru. So Carlos, it's your turn. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Well, hope Jose comes back soon. I want to speak today to you about business climate, which is something I constantly engage in my daily activities. I characterize 2020 as a stress test for business climate. Entrepreneurs have been exposed to COVID, to an inadequate government response and unprecedented economic contraction that Jose Carlos talked about, and then to that political mayhem that Juan Francisco alluded to at the beginning, an extremely populist Congress, something we haven't seen in at least 3 decades, and then and something we haven't seen since the 19th century, which is 3 presidents in 1 week. This is really something that nobody had imagined could happen. The good news is that we survived the stress test. The bad news is that we're not as fit as we thought we were. And I think that's basically the conclusion you can get from 2020. Business climate has turned negative over the last year. It's a trend that started around 2018, 2019, and it's really accelerated during 2020 for reasons that I will try to explain later on. I want to concentrate on this last part of the stress test, which is the political mayhem, and try to explain how we got here. Next slide. So the current Peruvian Constitution, enacted in 1979, it's been in place well over 30 years now. And what we have here is a chart of presidents elected under this Constitution and the percentage of Congress seats that they've enjoyed year to year. What you see is that in the 80s, the first 2 governments in the 80s had consolidated an important representation in Congress. And what happens in the 80s is political crisis, economic crisis, social crisis ends up destroying the traditional political party system in Peru. What you have in 1990 is the election of the first outsider, the first non-party president. And what we have since 1990 on forward, with the exception of those 5 years from Alan Garcia in the early 20th century, is non-traditional party presidents who've been elected and who have really not had significant congressional representation. Fujimori was the first of his class of these non-party presidents when he was elected in 1992. As you can see, next transition, please. He did not have a significant representation in Congress, only 19 seats. Next transition, please. And what that ended up with was the dissolution of Congress. Next, please. We do not see this extreme scenario of weak congressional representation again until the end of the Humala government in 2016, and then the last presidential cycle, which is PPK and Vizcarra, where they only managed to have 14% of Congress at the beginning of the term. We know that PPK confronted a hostile opposition in this Congress. He was eventually forced to resign. Vizcarra took over with an even weaker congressional representation. Next slide, please. Next transition. He ended up dissolving Congress when he was down to 4 congressmen. This was late 2019. And in what is probably going to be remembered as the greatest political fumble of all time, he did not submit a congressional list to the new Congress, to the new Congress election, and ended up having 0 congressmen after he dissolved the Congress. So basically, he had a Congress full of opposition members, which is something, I mean, it's having 70% approval rate after he dissolved Congress. He ended up with 0 congressmen in Congress. So what happened this year was inevitable, I think. Next slide, please. You have a Congress that's basically made up of close to a dozen political movements. I wouldn't even say parties here. There's only, I think, one traditional party in that group, with very dispersed ideologies. They're all opposition to Congress, and they're all seeking to build up their reputation for the forthcoming elections in 2021. So they're basically it's an entire opposition Congress that wants to show off and try to gain popularity, looking forward to the 2021 elections. It was really not, it was just a matter of time, and I think that the pandemic kind of slowed down this process, but it was a matter of time that this Congress was going to clash for the executive, and the president was going to be inevitably removed, as he was. Removal was not popular, as you all know. The interim president lasted for a week, and then a new interim president that was more of a consensus president was elected, and that's where we are right now. Next. The problem with this Congress is, and the composition of the current Congress is, and of course the forthcoming 2021 elections, is its propensity towards populism. As you can see, normally at the end of every Congress, congressional legislative activity tends to pick up, people trying to build up points with the electorate. This Congress has been particularly active in the last year, proposing a series of regulatory changes that are, as we call, populist, trying to build up popularity among the electorate, knowingly. This is very curious, knowingly that most of these propositions, these bills, are unconstitutional, and knowing that they will be overturned by the tribunal, by the Constitutional Tribunal, in a few months, but they get the law out, they'll get the votes that they want, and then when the law is overturned by the tribunal, it's the tribunal's fault, not my fault. And it's a way to try to build up their popularity, but at the same time, it's creating a very negative environment for business decisions to be adopted. Recently, we've seen the law that tries to regulate maximum interest rates. We've seen several attacks on the pension fund system. The agricultural sector has been heavily debated over the last couple of weeks, and a new law has been passed. Again, this is these are all very populist initiatives, many of which will end up being overturned by the constitutional tribunals. We have the institutional safeguards in place, but this entire process is very undermines confidence, and I think that that's somewhat reflected in the poll we did at the beginning of the webinar, and it's negative for business climate. Next one, please. Next slide. Unfortunately, the 2021 political cycle doesn't seem to resolve this. Here we go again. If you look at the 2021 electoral process that's underway, there are 24 political organizations authorized to run. A handful of these are, not even a handful, I'd say two, maybe, yeah, there are only 3 traditional political parties involved in this process. Several of these organizations are probably not even going to make it. Some are already dropping out because they're really trademarks more than political parties that are trying to get some sort of popularity and representation. What we're probably going to end up with in 2021 is, again, somewhat fragmented Congress with 6 or 7 political organizations and a president that's not going to have a clear majority again. So the success of the forthcoming president, whoever ends up being elected to run this country, will be largely dependent on his or her ability to build consensus among these 6 or 7 fragmented political groups and try to obtain some sort of governing governing alliance that allows them to push forward whatever agenda they're elected upon. The next one, please. This is how I characterize what's going to happen in 2020. The pandemic will ease, but side effects are going to linger. And they're going to linger for a while. What side effects are we talking about? The first side effects, well, COVID-19 regulations that restrict business activity in general, or limit it, or make it a little bit more costly, or export restrictions and so forth. These eventually will be phased out. So this is just a process as vaccination progresses and the pandemic dies down. These regulations should phase out. What I'm not too sure that will phase out is the government's appetite, or the executive appetite, to overregulate. I mean, the government and the bureaucracy has had a chance to overregulate the economy like it hadn't had since the 1980s, and it'll be interesting to see if they pull out of this propensity to overregulate once regulations are phased out. An overregulating executive or bureaucracy is not normally very business friendly, right? The second thing that I think we should keep an eye on is the congressional action. Congressional action will continue to be populist until the elections, and now it's a matter of who proposes the most outlandish bill that garnishes the most amount of votes. So we're going to see a lot of congressional action that is not very technical in the next couple of months. The other thing that the elections will bring about, and it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out, is an open public debate concerning our Constitution, and a debate concerning amendments, or eventually a full-blown constitutional assembly to rewrite the Constitution. And this is something that's inevitable. Every political party is going to bring it up in one form or another. Best case scenario, we come out of this process with amendments to the Constitution that fix the political organization side of the Constitution that's not working. Worst case scenario in this transition is that we come out with a full-blown assembly that actually concentrates on modifying investment rules, economic rules, and other positive aspects of the Constitution that have led to 3 decades of growth. I tend to think that we'll come out of this process somewhere in the middle. Not full-blown changes to the rules of the game. I do not think that any political party is going to try to kill the hen with the golden eggs. But amendments both to the political side of the political organization side of the Constitution, which is inevitable that we need to have, and some changes to the economic regime that the Constitution currently has to make it more social economy in the European sense. I think something like that is something we're going to see in the next couple of years. Again, the outcome of the elections and the ability of the new president to build consensus will determine whether or not these type of conflicts and this populism that we've lived in over the last couple of months will cease, or if it will continue. Hopefully, we have a president that's actually politically able to build these consensus, and populism and conflict begin to relax. The other key feature here is that the new Congress is going to appoint a new constitutional tribunal. The new constitutional tribunal is a key player here. The constitutional tribunal has been the gatekeeper within this mayhem that we've lived. It's finally been the institution that's been overturning these laws that are incompatible with our economic and constitutional regime. It's going to be interesting to see how this new election actually is carried out and what type of tribunals we get. It's a goalkeeper, it's a gatekeeper, it's the last line of defense against populism. It's very important that a strong constitutional tribunal is elected at the end of this process. Then I want to refer to the merger control law, which was actually published today in the newspaper. So it's coming into effect sometime in the summer, in the next 3 months. I want to refer to it because I think this is going to be a test drive of how regulations that affect private activity are going to be implemented in what I still believe to be an unprecedented anti-business climate. I've been practicing since the mid-90s, and I've never seen at the level of the executive and executive bureaucracy such an intense anti-business climate. It's reflected on several levels, from ministerial positions to a prime minister who was completely hostile to business activity last year. And we see this down to second and third level public officials right now. There's this very strong anti-business climate, very strong presumption that it's like there was a presumption that private business was bad or was trying to always do something that's bad. I think this is a backlash of the lava jato and all the corruption scandals that we had over the last couple of years, summed up with politicians that have effectively appointed members to the bureaucracy that are anti-business. And you see this every day. You see that government agencies are not as pro-business as they used to be. They're very zealous of business activity. Just yesterday, the president of the competition authority came out with a very, very strong message against private activity and merger. So the implementation of a merger law, when you have the president of the agency basically condemning mergers as evil, is going to be an interesting experience. I think, again, this is going to be a test run of how we are going to have to deal with a new bureaucracy or a new style of bureaucracy in the forthcoming years. I really don't see this being a trend that can easily be reverted. It's something we're going to have to learn to live with, a bureaucracy that's hostile that's somewhat hostile to business activity, and we're going to have to learn to negotiate and deal and steer through the red tape to get the outcomes that we wish to obtain for our business purposes. And yeah, that's basically how I see business climate moving on forward during this year. Juan Francisco.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for that valuable insight. I cannot help but, based on your comments, I have to say that I'm scratching my head and I'm trying to figure out which has been more damaging, COVID-19 or populism. Many of our countries are suffering both, but I guess against COVID-19 we have no vaccines. I guess the only vaccine I see against populism is full involvement of a more democratic system where citizenship has a greater role in what happens in our region. And of course, things like what happened yesterday in the US is precisely the type of things you would want to think cannot happen in any country, let alone the US. So that's it's definitely an eye-opener and something we have to consider, moving forward. I guess the solution is clear: more citizens, less demagogues. I'm sure we could talk about that for a long time, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So we have to keep with our sequence. For this purpose, what I propose now is that I will present to each of the panelists 2 questions based on the feedback we've been receiving from the audience. And I would ask each of the panelists to use this opportunity to answer the 2 questions that I'll pose to each one of you and to deliver final comments. And again, unfortunately, we're crushed with time. So we will need for each of you to take no more than 2-3 minutes to go through these questions and give us your final comments. I'll start with Jose, who we unfortunately we lost at the mercy of technological issues, but we have him back. So Jose, I have 2 questions and then your final comments. The 2 questions I have for you is, what is the social environment for the development of mining projects in Peru? And are there any restrictions for foreigners to own real estate property in Peru? So Jose, please address these questions and give us your closing comments.
First of all, I just want to apologize for the technical problems I had. I came to the office to avoid the technical problems, and Murphy Law applied this time. So sorry for that. Part of my presentation included mining as one of the key sectors that would be important for Peruvian recovery, and also the real estate market, which we think is a sector which is currently unattended and a potential sector for investment. So the 2 questions that you make, Juan Francisco, apply to these 2 sectors. In the case of the social environment for development of mining projects is certainly complicated in countries like Peru, where you have native and ancient populations located in the areas where mining usually takes place, which is in the Andes. But and we have examples of projects that have not been able to develop, like Conga or Tia Maria, because of social unrest. But we also have seen very good examples of mining companies dealing adequately with the relationship with their local communities and have not had any major problems or setbacks in the development of mining projects. So I think it's something that mining operators need to bear in mind, that the handling and managing the relationship with local communities is something that they need to do since before they start developing or exploring a project. That needs to be something that needs to be carefully considered and dealt with from the initial stages of a mining project. And on any restrictions on foreigners owning real estate in Peru, the Peruvian Constitution establishes only one restriction, which is having that foreigners cannot own or possess real estate in areas that are within 50 kilometers from the international borders of Peru. But even in those cases, if the ownership does not imply any risk to foreign sovereignty or security, the foreigners can obtain a presidential decree allowing them to possess and own that kind of ownership in those areas. So in general, there are no restrictions except for those areas near the international border.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for those additional comments that are obviously important and to cater to our audience. I would like now to move to Carlos. Carlos, I have 2 questions for you. Is the new merger control regime convergent with international standards? What do you expect? And is in that same context, is the antitrust authority institutionally prepared to handle this new assignment? I would also add there's a question on the pension fund and whether the pensions are at risk based on your assessment of political and business risks this year.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Let's see. First, the merger control law. The merger control law, the one that's been published today in the newspaper, more than a new law, is really an amendment to the law that was already enacted and that was going to come into force on March 1st. The thing is that those 4 or 5 minor amendments that they've made to this law, what they do is reveal this anti-business sentiment that I was talking about. They're very subtle, but things like that the executive branch cannot increase thresholds if they deem that they were originally set too low. That's been eliminated. The possibility for the agency to review ex officio concentrations that do not surpass the thresholds, which is extremely delicate. That's been incorporated into the law. The elimination of the failing firm defense to get authorization for a merger has been eliminated from the law, which is kind of a head scratcher, considering that that's probably going to be a very popular issue after post-COVID restructurings get underway. So this law again is relatively convergent with EU standards, but it has been contaminated with 4 or 5 subtle amendments by this Congress that again reveal this anti-business sentiment that is somehow now relatively widespread among the bureaucracy. So again, we're going to have to keep an eye on that and see how Indicopy actually implements this. They are working heavily towards being prepared to implement this law. The issue here is that there is a necessary learning curve. I think that the sooner that curve is surpassed, the better. I'm not that confident that the current political climate will allow them to quickly start issuing strong technical authorizations that reestablish or that create a relatively stable climate for M&A review moving forward. The problem with this law, and I've always said it, is that while the law is convergent with EU standards in the most part, it does not really do much in the way of reinforcing the institutional framework that the agency works with and granting it greater political autonomy, so to secure that decisions handed down are not political but rather technical. So again, it's going to be an interesting test drive for what lies ahead in the forthcoming years, how this law is finally implemented. Now, regarding the pension system question, which I see on screen, I think it's inevitable again that some sort of reform out of the private pension system will emerge in the next couple of years, when the long-term returns of the private pension fund system do not outpace government bond yields significantly, then we have a problem. And this is something that I think is happening here, is happening in Chile and so forth. It's really not so much the pension system's problem as it is a problem more related to the lack of depth in the local stock market that limits the ability of greater returns on investment obtained by the pension fund system. But something's going to have to come out of this. I mean, some sort of reform. It's just going to be radical and disruptive. I would think that it won't. If we're looking at a pension fund reform system being disruptive or radical, then we're facing a scenario in which the central bank and the Ministry of Economy have lost all its power. And if we're in that system, well, let's just pack up and go, because it's the central bank and the Ministry of Economy that, within this mayhem, keep things on the right track. And I don't think that neither of these two institutions will allow for a radical or disruptive change of the pension fund system. Something will have to yield. There will have to be reforms. It's a system that's necessarily has to improve, and we're not the only country that has these issues, but a disruptive change or radical change in the system is something that would only happen if Peru really shifts hard towards radical policies, which again, I'm very optimistic is not in the works right now.
Hopefully that's the case, Carlos. That would be obviously a major mistake. And again, we've seen what happens in other countries when they cross that the line. The consequences can be pretty devastating. Last but not least, Juan Carlos, I have two questions for you and also your final comments. Do you foresee a significant recovery in Peru in 2021? And also, how will Peru compare in that context with other countries in the region in this year in 2021? And your final comments, please.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. It's very interesting now because Peru had one of the deepest recessions in the world in 2020, but will have one of the strongest recoveries in 2021. So if you average the 2 years, then there will be other countries that maybe were not that affected in 2020 that will grow slower than, or will recover slower than that Peru. And those countries are, for example, I think of Argentina, Ecuador, for example. No. Now the Peruvian economy is falling less than other Latin American countries, and that is explained by this sharp recovery in the last few quarters. So that's why I mentioned the growth rate that we expect for this year will be around 9%, 8, 10%, and this is very important. But maybe the most important thing about this year is what Carlos mentioned. This year we define our future in terms of institutionality, the rule of law, with all those discussions about the constitution and so on. So this year will be key to understand the next 5 years in the Peruvian economy. And as a final remarks, I would like to add something to what I mentioned before. Even though I mentioned that the economic recovery in the levels of production from now on, from now to the next few quarters will be kind of slow, it doesn't mean that the Peruvian economy the Peruvian economy doesn't create business opportunities. As Jose mentioned, infrastructure poses a great opportunities in Peru because of the infrastructure gap, and digitalization also is growing a lot due to the pandemic, and it poses a lot of opportunities. And also, it doesn't mean that the Peruvian economy will be static. I think, on the contrary, it will be very dynamic, with a lot with the flows of resources from affected sectors or affected companies to growing sectors or growing firms. This will be a very dynamic environment. There will be, in my opinion, some consolidation processes in different markets, and I think the M&A activity will rebound, and that will be a test, as Carlos mentioned, for this new law of mergers. And finally, some companies implemented a lot of cost cuts during this pandemic, and they have a lot of liquidity. So that's one point. And the other is that many companies will try to gain market share during this environment. They will innovate in order to grow, and this will increase competition. So I don't think that this environment will be that we won't see opportunities to do business, and I think we will see a very dynamic environment in these few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose Carlos. That was very informative, and we hope obviously that your estimates and guesstimates, estimations of what will happen in Peru materialize. I'm sure that's going to happen. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and we could go on as topics are interesting and relevant for all of our attendants. The good part is that you have our contact information, and we will gladly address any remaining questions or follow-up queries. I know there were some attendants that were requesting copies of your presentation, so I will allow our friends in Peru to facilitate those slides to be delivered to attendants that actually request them. I'm sure that is not going to be a problem. We cannot thank you enough for having made the time to join us today. Both of our firms are available to assist you in Peru with my colleagues from Payet, Rey, Caubis, Perez Abogados, and in the rest of the jurisdictions where Hogan Lovells has its own offices, like in Mexico City, Monterrey, and Sao Paulo, or in any other places where we directly or indirectly operate in a seamless manner. We trust you have liked the webinar today, and that technology has allowed us to be present with you with required safety measures. It is important to abide by sanitary restrictions, as the emergency is not over and will not be, unfortunately, for quite a few months still. Hopefully, we will be able to greet you all personally during this year. And in the meantime, let us benefit from these technological tools. Please stay safe and see you soon. And again, thank you, Jose Carlos, Jose, and Carlos, for your very valuable comments. And I'm sure the materials and the deliverables today have been of great value for our attendance. So again, gracias a todos. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon. Gracias.